Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the study in the book of Acts. I'm your host, John Korkodakis, and thanks for being here tonight. This is a really important night, by the way, because this is one of my favorite sections in the book of Acts. So if you've noticed, if you've downloaded the notes, and if you've noticed, we have a lot to go through, but it's really jam-packed. So I hope you're ready for a really intense study with a lot of really good components to this particular study. But I hope you're excited to be part of this. Once again, if you can like the videos or share them, or if you're new to this and you want to subscribe, that would be great. Okay. Now, I'm really happy. Earlier on today, for those of you in Ontario, that Rogers was having all kinds of problems. And I thought, oh no, I hope tonight doesn't get delayed, because, like I said, this is one of my favorite sections in the book of Acts. And I think you're going to be greatly encouraged and really inspired tonight with so much that this section teaches us and brings to the forefront for our modern application today. So we're going to dive into 4 chapters tonight. I apologize to any of you if I end up running over a little bit tonight. There's the potential of doing that, but if you need to leave and check out, you can always go back and hear the final sections of this study. But there is a lot to go through. So if I have to skip over parts and you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask questions. So it's really cool that you're here. I hope you're ready to buckle down and learn some really neat things about the book of Acts, because it's got so much to teach us today. So if you have your notes, we're starting in chapter 15, and right out of the gate, chapter 15 starts with a really precarious statement that really highlights the difficulties that the early church experienced. It says that some people came and they were teaching that you had to be circumcised to be saved. Now that's a really incredible statement, that it's right in the Bible. It actually states what the Jewish people were teaching at the time. And this is the real challenge of the church. So in other words, unless you had this medical procedure, you could not go to heaven. That's basically what is being taught. So this created a kind of a crisis moment for the church. And it essentially is the question now becomes, what constitutes the people of God? Because for the Jewish people, circumcision was a sign of the covenant, and it was the sign of you being, the people of God. Of course, it kind of did away with the whole heart thing and having faith in Yahweh and all of that stuff. And that's the distortion that happens when certain rituals become part of the doctrinal component itself. And we're seeing this happen that's challenging the early church. Now, in chapter 15, we have the Jerusalem Council, who have to decide how to proceed from here. Now, this is a historical moment for the church, even for the church today, because based on what was decided at that particular time, the church, the early church, could have simply become Judaism part 2 or version 2.0. But that is not, what we see happen here. And what happens here really sets the stage for this new work that's happening called the Ecclesia, the church. And that's what we have today. But there's a dramatic departure and a statement that is made in the Jerusalem Council that sets the tone for the church. And I think this is absolutely, the hints are, this is absolutely prompted by the Holy Spirit. This isn't just, men who are just making a decision about the structure of what constitutes, this thing called the Ecclesia. This is absolutely Holy Spirit inspired, because the entire book of Acts is Holy Spirit inspired. And we're seeing the workings of the Spirit of God in everything that is happening in the early church. So the meeting convenes, and Luke once again stresses the Lord's initiative in the spread of the gospel and all the things that were, being experienced in a supernatural way. And there's this whole debate that goes on, and Peter addresses the apostles and the elders, and the conviction that all are experiencing salvation in the same way, the undeserved grace of the Lord Jesus Christ. And again, I would argue that even grace got distorted in the Old Testament with Judaism, that grace in some way took a back seat to the law. But the law was an expression of grace as much as what we see in the New Testament, in the sense of, the free gift that is being offered of salvation. So James, as a reminder of, the half-brother of Jesus, simply comes and quotes from Isaiah, Amos 9, and it charts the course of the church from then on in. And, for James to stand up and to make this statement and to be the voice of the church at this particular time is incredibly powerful. And he gives 4 prohibitions, and 3 of them are related to Jewish sensitivities, to the moral and ethical purity. So he kind of, builds a bridge between the Jewish people and the new community of the church, with ethical and moral purity against things like idolatry. The second thing, those are 3 prohibitions that he gives in the text. The 4th one has to do with sexual immorality, and it stands in a category all by itself. Okay? All right. Now, with that introduction, I just got reminded that I'm not putting my notes up again. Thank you, Jennifer. I get carried away. Thank you very much for letting me know. So those are the things that happen, and those 4 prohibitions are the only thing. But this sets the course in the book of Acts for a whole new understanding for the church, and what that means as the church moves forward. It's built on a different concept in terms of it's not the law, it's not the rituals, it's the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, his sacrificial death, his miraculous resurrection to new life as a precursor to what we can enjoy as believers in Jesus Christ. Now, James says something really powerful too. He says in verse 19 of chapter 5, he says, maybe I should just read it. James says, "It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God." That is really incredible that he says that. And I think that sets the tone for the church, and it should set the tone for our church, for the modern church today, is to take away the impediments of those that are turning towards God. I put in the notes, I think there's 4 drifts that we see in churches if we're not careful. We get the first drift away from Jesus as the head of the church. Myself as a pastor, I'm not the head of the church. Jesus Christ is the head of the church. That's a drift away, that we become a social club, or we become, rooted in social justice issues and not on Christ being the head of the church. The drift to being exclusive to insiders, and we miss the whole great commissioning of what the church should be responsible for. The drift of placing excessive demands on outsiders, and that's directly out of verse 19 in chapter 5. we have to be very, very careful on what we demand on outsiders. I remember being told I didn't dress properly. I didn't have the right Bible. I didn't, I needed to have all these other things in place before I would get accepted by the group. So, I myself have experienced, the feeling like an outsider, that I didn't belong. But this was a club exclusively for the people that had the right elements. And then the drift of protecting rather than advancing. We protect our ground. By the way, I think that's a real danger nowadays. I think in the midst of the pandemic, there are a lot of churches out there that are protecting ground that they think is sacred, that they think is their right to protect. And I don't see that scripturally, to be honest. I see that we are to move into the world and to be light in dark times, and to be one, and to proclaim the gospel of Christ, and not to talk about our rights, or not talk about protecting our place in society or anything like that. So those are kind of like the four drifts that happen. So the church sends 4 representatives, which is actually a practice of the Greco-Roman times. Whenever there's an official decision that was being, delivered, they would send 4 people. There was a protocol to this, and it was really powerful. Imagine all the men. I know this is a bit crass, but imagine all the men who were waiting for this decision that heard from the Jerusalem council and saying, yeah, you don't need to be circumcised. And like, thank you. Thank you for that decision. And the church, it says, received the decision with joy. And to be able to say that, they recognized the full authority of the council. And Judas and Silas, both called prophets, dedicate their time to strengthening and encouraging the believers. You're going to see this. And hopefully, if you've been reading these passages beforehand, hopefully you have seen this, by the way, the strengthening and encouraging that the leadership or the prophets or the missionaries are continually doing for the churches that are becoming established. That is a 1-2 punch to strengthen them, it encouraged them. And I think those are 2 things that we see over and over in the book of Acts. Okay? Now, in the next slide here, let me just get it up here. There's a disagreement. We come to this point where there's a disagreement between Paul and Barnabas, and it has to do with let me just back up here for a minute as I'm looking at my notes. Much speculation has been made about what the disagreement really entailed. And we're not told. We're just told that they had a disagreement. And, I just want to be very careful with the speculation that we have for the disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. Now, we know later on that they get back together and, it's everything's okay. Whatever the disagreement had to do with gets resolved at some point. And one of the beautiful things about having this section is that there was conflict in the early church. There was personality clashes. They were not perfect. Sometimes we think they are perfect. But the fact of the matter is there was a spirit of reconciliation as well, which is very important for us to recognize. So, you cannot have a strong church if it does not have conflict and if it doesn't have reconciliation. It's almost like those 3 ingredients have to come together. That's how you build a unified church. And again, the section concludes with Paul strengthening the churches. And it's the Greek terms that's being used here is all about being firmly established. And it's a beautiful Greek word, and it talks about the solidity of what Paul is doing into the lives of the people. And what we see by this encouragement and strengthening is that in many ways, evangelism and discipleship go hand in hand. They're not, in the book of Acts, I would argue they're not two separate entities. They are one and the same. You bring someone to Christ, you strengthen and encourage them and build them up in the Lord. That's part of the process. So it's not, two separate entities. All right, let's move on to the Macedonian call. Macedonia, they're traveling west, and some commentators notice that 4 centuries earlier, Alexander the Great would have traveled this very part of the world. So we're introduced to Timothy. Now here's I don't know if you noticed this when you read, and I just cannot believe this. This is such an incredible lesson. The Jerusalem Council just got done saying that you don't need to be circumcised to be saved. They had just finished making that pronouncement. That's on the authority of the council and all this stuff. And then all of a sudden we were introduced to Timothy. And it says they circumcised Timothy, in order to make him acceptable to a Jewish audience. Now, wow. Let me tell you. So if you read that, you got to read it in the context of the larger. They did this not because it was the thing to be saved. They did this so Timothy could witness to Jewish people. This is part of 1 Corinthians 9, if you read the Apostle Paul, that, to the Jews I became like a Jew so that only I could win some. To the Greeks I became like the Greeks in order that I could win some. And here's a wonderful example, especially so close to the Jerusalem Council that just made this decision that you don't have to do this. But they were so wanting to reach the people that they were willing to do something like this in order to say, I can identify with you. I know exactly what it means to be part of the covenant people. I'm an outsider. Timothy wasn't, and here he is, experiencing circumcision so that he is a credible witness to the Jewish people. Paul demonstrates the importance of training young leaders. I've said this many, many times. For years, I was sort of presented the Apostle Paul as the incredible theologian. He's the one that gives us the incredible doctrinal concepts of justification, sanctification, salvation, and does it in the technical terms. But what Paul gets really short-changed over is his incredible pastoral heart and ability. The way that the way that he plants churches, the way that he strengthens churches, the way that he encourages them on a regular basis, the way that he prays for them, the way that he trains up young leaders. We know that it wasn't just Timothy. There were many more. His missionary heart and the way that he spreads the gospel. There's just so much about Paul that's pastoral at his heart. And it's a beautiful picture. And Acts really brings this out to bear. And other books that he's written to certain churches, especially 2 Corinthians, just reveals Paul's heart and his heartbreak actually for the church. So this is a beautiful thing. So, Paul and Silas, in their traveling, they're experiencing resistance until Paul has this vision one night, and it becomes the call to Macedonia. Well, the urgency of leaving Macedonia is confirmed once the vision is recognized as being authentic. And here we have one of the first "we" passages. If you've read any commentators or any scholars about the book, there's these moments where suddenly Luke, as he's writing this, says "we," bringing him into the story. So it's an indicator that some of this stuff is actually being written by Luke, who experienced it firsthand himself. It's not just getting it from, another source or whatever. He's talking about the time that he was there as part of it as well. So again, an important thing to recognize. Okay, let's go into the next slide here. The journey to Philippi. Now this is really cool. By the way, I'm still really heartbroken that we never got to take the trip to Greece. I was gonna do a tour of Greece in May of 2020. It still breaks my heart that had to get canceled, and a good thing because COVID hit and it would have been canceled anyway. But one of the cities I was really looking forward, actually I was looking forward to Thessalonica and Philippi. And Philippi was one of the cities that I really was looking forward to going. And this, outside on the battlefield, outside of Philippi, did you know that Mark Antony and Octavian defeated the assassins of Julius Caesar, Brutus and Cassius, in 42 BC? That's kind of like the claim to fame of this particular city, because many former Roman soldiers absolutely populated the city. Now, what happens here in Philippi is something really new. The pattern for entering a synagogue is broken here. You notice that every time that Paul entered a city, the first place he goes is a synagogue. It took 10 Jewish men to establish a synagogue. And it implies here that the requirement for 10 men, Jewish men, to establish a synagogue has not been met. There's no synagogue in Philippi at this particular time. So when there wasn't a synagogue, the custom was that the people would meet in open air by a river or the sea because of the natural water that they used for cleansing and purification. So you'll notice that Lydia and them are actually by a river. So this is the way when the synagogue is not there. So this breaks the pattern. But Paul finds these people, and that's how he communicates with them. And in this particular section, Luke does this beautiful thing where he talks about 3 portraits of 3 different people who have changed lives. And the first one is Lydia. She's a successful businesswoman. The second is this demon-possessed girl, slave girl. And the third is the jailer, the Philippian jailer. So there's this progression that happens from simple gospel proclamation to more miraculous evidence. And they also represent wildly divergent groups. These are not the same kind of social categories that you find yourself in. And again, it's Luke's way of once again demonstrating that the gospel's for everyone, regardless. It's an important component. And even certain Roman laws restricted people, those who could wear purple, and that was Lydia's business, is making this purple dye, and that's the essence of her clientele. Then, and the name also reflects a place of origin, the Lydian kingdom. There's a lot of speculation where she could have originated from, and there's an implication that where she comes from is what inspired the myth of King Midas. And in fact, a lot of people there's a number of archaeologists that say that's no longer a myth. Like, even though the King Midas story may have been exaggerated, that there was in fact a king who hoarded gold to such an extent. And again, it's in Asia Minor, and there's been a lot of excavations in that area confirming that there likely was this king who had this reputation when it came to gold. So there's baptisms that happen. And what's really cool is the baptisms are a direct response to people coming to be saved. That it's become a part of the early church, that if you make a proclamation of faith and you say, Jesus is now my Lord and Savior, that the first response that you would have is to get baptized. That's the next natural progression. Now, I happen to think it's because of the close association to the whole Jewish idea of purification and water purification. And the Jewish people were not the only ones that had it. There were other kind of cultures that had the kind of rite of water purification. So in the mindset of that culture, in the mindset of the world at the time, it was a natural progression that when you make a proclamation of whatever it is that you believe, there's some sort of water purification ritual that went, alongside it. And culturally, that it was really easy for people to say, this is my next step. But in our modern world, we don't have that water purification idea. It's more a function of, keeping our bodies hydrated more than anything else. And yes, we have water for cleaning and that kind of stuff, but we don't see it as a personal purification component in a lot of our lives. So we have this baptisms, and with Lydia, when you read the story of Lydia, her first act is hospitality. It's an implication that she sees this as a test of her faith, which is really beautiful. Okay, so we're tracking along really good. I hope you guys are staying up. Now with the demon-possessed girl, the Greek is actually pneuma, pythanos, which is python spirit of divination, and this is this goes back to mythology, by the way. The oracle sanctuary of Delphi. This is really common oracle kind of language, and comes right out of a story of Apollo slaying this python. Paul casts out the demons, and because of that, there's accusations, and it's the first official indictment against Paul recorded in Acts. And there's this huge uproar because this slave girl has been prophesying, and see her as a financial benefit, and that's always a bad thing when that happens. So you're going to see in Acts 16-9 four encounter scenes and the similar sequence of events. Christians are detained and brought before public officials. The second thing is they are accused, accentuated by an accuser's direct quotation. I heard them say this. And then thirdly, the reason given is to curb the Christian mission. In every one of these confrontations, the end result is to stop these people from proclaiming Christ every time. So, for those of you that are wondering that we're, how does this affect the early church? The early church, that was their line. That was the line that they wouldn't cross. When you're told that you can no longer proclaim Christ, that's when they went against, government officials. That's when they went against the other religions, all that kind of stuff. But as long as they could proclaim Christ, that was, in my estimation of the book of Acts, that's what was the line. Okay? So anyway, because of that, the accusations against the apostles taken as fact. They're beaten, thrown into prison. And we never find out anything more about the slave girl. Did she ever become a believer? We don't know. It's just left at that. But the incident does become the catalyst for the jailer's conversion. It becomes what God uses to get to the life and the family of the jailer. And, what ends up happening is Paul and Silas are praying and singing. And, I'm sure other people in the jail were wondering what is going to, these guys are celebrating this, and their freedom ends up coming by way of a miracle. And obviously the jailer becomes a believer. His family becomes a believer. And here another thing happens. There's a couple of other things happens. Many people believe that Paul uses this experience, by the way, in writing the book of Philippians, because he writes a book to this particular city, and it's rooted in joy, even though he's writing it out of prison. But I think there's a flashback for him of this moment where he saw the miraculous work of God and the people who are being saved. And it's here at this particular juncture of the story, near the end of this, where the whole matter of citizenship for Paul gets raised. The whole humiliation of being arrested and ending up in jail and all of that kind of stuff, to make a false claim against a citizen of the Roman Empire actually meant the death penalty. And a number of times you wonder why Paul didn't just stand up and say, hey, I'm a citizen of Rome, but instead went to prison. Because I think he sensed that the Spirit of God was saying, we have something in store for the jailer. We have something, much better in store here. And again, this whole thing concludes with the Apostle Paul encouraging believers. Now that becomes, remember at the very beginning I said, imagine the number of things that get rotated, and this is one of those things. This whole idea of being encouraged and strengthened becomes a really common refrain. Okay, I'm getting carried away, and I didn't move a slide ahead. No, actually, that was the end of that. So, but Robert, yeah, you wonder if Othio or Syntyche mentioned in Philippians could have been, might have been the slave girl. That's very, very possible. That's very possible. Wouldn't that be really neat to connect those two? But yeah, that's a great point. But that's very possible. It's not outside of the realm of possibility. So I know I just talked a whole bunch of stuff that really wasn't in the notes here, but we're moving on now to preaching in Thessalonica. And present day Thessalonica is where one of the major Greek seminaries for the Orthodox Church is. I remember one time many years ago when I was contemplating going into ministry. I remember my dad saying, well, if you're going to go to the Greek, you can go back to Greece, you can go to Thessalonica, the big seminary there, or the one in Chicago. And my dad's, I'm looking at my dad going, yeah, okay, that's interesting. But that's what exists there in modern day. And it would have been really neat because, again, one of the cities we were going to was Thessalonica. The synagogue, now they're back at the synagogue. It's the starting place of preaching there. And here Luke's stressing Paul's use of reason. And this is a wonderful key apologetic in a Greek context where we're seeing how Paul is adapting to the way that he communicates to particular audiences. Some are persuaded, and Luke again mentions the role that women play. Women, we saw this in Philippi with Lydia and the slave girl, and in fact even the family of the jailer in some ways. The inclusion of women continues the theme of gospel equality. And here in Thessalonica, the Jews are characterized as being jealous. It's in Greek, it's both positive and negative. And in the context, the last two, it's an attitude of misplaced zeal, and it's a hostile emotion based on resentment. So the Jewish people see the power that's being used by Paul in bringing people to the gospel. And there's resentment, there's hatred, there's all kinds of stuff. And the accusations that the Jewish people give really start taking dramatic tones. And we talked in the last section about, the patterns that you start to see. And here the patterns are repeated again. The message is causing trouble. And here's the dramatic part, around the world. Around the world. So like This isn't just a local thing. This is affecting our entire world. And secondly, Jesus is a challenge to Caesar. Therefore, this is an act of treason. If he's threatening Caesar, he's threatening like the emperor, the godhead of the Roman Empire. So Jesus is absolutely a threat. So we need to deal with this movement. And Jason is the person that was harboring them in Thessalonica and taking care of them. This Jason person, he's harboring fugitives. So we should do something. Now, fortunately, in Thessalonica, the charges don't stick, and they are released. And when they're released, they end up going into Berea. I don't have these notes here, but Berea, this is the next town that they move into from Thessalonica. So they've gone from Philippi, Thessalonica, into Berea, and once again they enter the synagogue, and the people are a little bit more open-minded than the Thessalonians. They appear to be well-versed. These are the people who are well-versed in the scriptures. And Paul uses that to their advantage. Again, when you read this section, you would have seen Paul adapt his tactic to utilize the scriptures in the way that, in order to communicate these people who knew the scriptures really well. But again, many come to faith, but there's Jews that once again cause Paul to be sent away under the cover of night. And he leaves Silas and Timothy behind. Okay, so here's one of my favorite parts. Here's the next slide as we move from this section to this section. Okay, now there's Paul in Athens. Okay, so there's a progression in chapter 17. And the one that culminates in Athens. 3 cities have been visited, each with their own, characteristics, and each we see Paul shaping his witness and his testimony and his sermons to adapt. To the Thessalonians, he appealed to them with reason. To the Bereans, he allowed scripture to confirm his teaching. To the Athenians, he appeals to their sense of religiosity. Now, Athens at the time is the cultural center of the country. And consequently, the land that gave Socrates and Aristotle and Plato was also the capital of idolatry. And the reaction of Paul is really telling. In Athens, most of us would have expected him to be awestruck by the beauty. Like he would have seen the Parthenon and all its glory and things like that, and the craftsmanship. But instead, he's deeply distressed. He's deeply distressed by the idolatry. Now, this is significant. When he enters Athens, he's deeply distressed by the idolatry. And we'll read something when we get to Corinth that is really quite telling as well about the character of the Apostle Paul. So in Athens at that particular time, there's 2 schools of philosophy that are mentioned, at least in this passage. It's the Epicureans, who were disciples of Epicurus, and pleasure for them was the greatest virtue. And you could classify it as agnostic secularism. So pleasure was, happiness, all of that. There's a streak of Epicureanism philosophy in our world today. If it's all about happiness, if all about my personal pleasure and what brings me joy. Okay, so you could say that. The Stoics are the other ones that are mentioned, and they were disciples of Zeno, the Cypriot, so from Cyprus, where Barnabas was from. So rationalism and self-sufficiency and to live in harmony with nature, that's kind of like the essence of Stoic philosophy. And they see everything as God, and were known to be quite arrogant. And what's really interesting is that Stoicism is having a resurgence in our world today. A huge resurgence in, I forget the name of the book. Something is the way. but it's selling like hotcakes. But Stoicism is actually making a resurgence. I would argue that both of these schools of philosophical thought are really finding traction in our culture today. But this is what Paul is up against. And I like this note. I can't remember what comment. I can't remember exactly where I got it from, but or it might have been my own insight because I don't reference it to something. But these are two great enemies that Paul faced. Pleasure and pride in these two philosophies, and of course, those are difficult philosophies to kind of battle against when somebody's ingrained in all of that. Now, I have a picture I want to show you. Because it talks about Mars Hill, and I want to just get my webcam out of here. This is Mars Hill, for those of you that are familiar with this particular passage, because Paul it talks about Paul being on Mars Hill. If you ever wonder what Mars Hill is, that's a picture of Mars Hill. Now, I took this picture myself last time we were in Athens, and I took this picture from the Propylaea, which is the entrance to the Acropolis. And if you ever get a chance to go to Athens and you're going up the stairs up to the Acropolis and you look out from the gates of the Acropolis, you'll see this mound in the distance, and you'll see people on it, and that is what's called the Areopagus, or Mars Hill. And this Mars Hill is where the ecclesia, the early, people of the Athenians who were called to mediate courts or to hear philosophers and to debate and things like that. This is where it often happened. And if you go there today, there's a stairwell going up to the mound, and it actually has this section of Acts in Greek just beside the stairs. I think in between the trees, right about, I think here or something, you can see the stairs going up onto the plateau of this mount. And in Greek mythology, this is the hill where Ares, the god of war, stood trial for murder of Poseidon's son, Alarithos. And it rises like some 377 feet, and it's close to the Acropolis. And the Agora, by the way, would have been further, if I get my orientation right, if I remember it, further west of this particular mount. And the Agora was the marketplace, which was the main marketplace of the city of Athens. And it was the meeting place, as we talked about, the highest judicial body for civil, criminal, and religious matters. And again, the term ecclesia originally meant a convening body selected for a specific purpose. And Paul takes this terminology and applies it to the body of believers. And at its entrance, there's, as I said, this bronze plaque in Greek of Acts 17. Now, because of this, because of Paul speaking to these Greek philosophers and the people on Mars Hill and the debates going on, he actually uses the term, I see you have the altar of the unknown God. Now, in Greek, agnosto is the term for unknown God. And that's where we get the term agnostic from, meaning unknowable or not recognizable. Dendonorizo is another way that we say that term in modern Greek. And did you know that there was a biologist by the name of Thomas Henry Huxley who coined the term in 1869, and he coined the term agnostic, and he actually lifted it directly out of the Greek text and coined the term about someone, when it came to a philosophy of God, he would say, I'm agnostic, which means he's unknowable and can't be sure of God. And that's where the terminology actually came out of this text. Okay, so let me put myself back in the picture. I'm really proud of taking that picture. It's a lot of fun that I got a chance to see that. But that's Mars Hill if you ever wanted to go and know what we're talking about. Now, Paul's message to the Athenians is can be outlined as followed, and it's brilliant in its progression of argumentation, if you want to say it that way. He has a cultural connection point. I see you have the altar of an unknown God. Okay, so let's talk about that. And let me tell you about him, because you don't know him, but I do. And notice that he, the cultural accommodation that Paul makes with this altar, he uses it as a bridge, as a way of dialoguing what he needs to say to these people. And he starts talking about this unknown God that I'm telling you about. He created everything. He gives life to everything. And he's sovereign over all. Okay? And remember, this is a culture with a whole plethora or pantheon of gods. That they've had all these different gods. And now they're hearing about the one that created all things, the central. This is greater than Zeus. Okay? There's purpose and reason to our lives. We're not an abstraction. We are not, a mistake here. There's reason that we are to be here, and the primary reason is to know him. As he is. God has given us a revelation, and though we are fallen, he has made himself known. And here's where he makes the bridge. He's made himself known through his Son, Jesus Christ. So we no longer have to doubt or wonder. In fact, you don't have to put another altar up about being an unknown God. Now you can put a placemat on that particular altar and forget all the others. So it's really, a beautiful demonstration of the kinds of things that Paul would utilize in order to get the message of Jesus across. And as with all messages in Acts, there's a division in the way the people respond, which is common. And I happen to find that heartening. Even the Apostle Paul, there are people that would walk away scratching their heads going, I don't get this. I don't believe this right now. All of that kind of stuff. We'd love everybody to come to faith when they hear the gospel. But the reality is, not everybody is willing to accept it right away. And yet for the Apostle Paul, there are people that came and responded. And Luke notes that Dionysius, a council member, and a woman, Damaris, again showing his preference for male-female contrast. He names these two people. And by the way, Dionysius, there's a letter of Dionysius that's really common in the early church. I'm not linking it to this particular person, but if you ever get a chance to read the letter of Dionysius, it's a really powerful witness testimony letter of the early church too. And it's not canonized and not anything like that, but it's a fascinating letter about the early believers. And the central controversy of Paul's message, of course, is the resurrection. It becomes the stumbling block. It becomes for those who believe, the thing that says, yes, this is something to believe in. But for others, it's like the block that happens. So Athens is really a significant, I think, part of the Acts story, because he's speaking to the most heavily influenced philosophical city at the time, other than probably Alexandria. Alexandria would have been another huge place. Rome had its own issues because of the whole emperor worship thing, but it had its own issues too as far as this. So this is a significant demonstration of Paul's oratory skills in using cultural accommodation in order to proclaim the good news. Okay, we're almost done, and thanks for sticking with me. I know it's been a whirlwind, and I hope you're learning some stuff and you're being encouraged by some stuff. The next section is finding Paul in Corinth. Now, again, Thessalonica, Philippi, Berea, Athens, Corinth. And by the way, when I was going to do this tour of Greece, this is the progression of the tour. We would have, and I'm really sad that we could not have done Corinth. I've taught the books of First and Second Corinthians for a number of years now, as well as part of my responsibility at Heritage, and it was going to be really neat to go through some of the artifacts in museums and stuff like that at Corinth. But Corinth was an important city in the Roman Empire. Now, some of you are going to have older notes and says that, Corinth was the third largest city. And there's a lot of debate because if you remember your notes, Antioch in Syria was the third largest city. So there's confusion about which one was actually bigger. But most scholars lean towards Antioch because Corinth was such a city that had so many people coming and going because of the harbor and the type of city that it was, and it was the Las Vegas of its day. So there was a lot of hedonism, debauchery, sexual immorality, and that's one of the reasons why sailors would show up there, because it was not only was it a seaport, a sea area, but it attracted the undesirables in this way. In fact, at that time period, there was a particular phrase. If you called somebody a Corinthian, in that day and age, you were calling them a sexual deviant. That's how much the city's reputation existed, and it was known around the known world at that time. So you couldn't, get away with, if somebody called you a Corinthian. That's what everybody understood it to be. So we talked about Paul being distressed, grieved over the idolatry of Athens when he entered Athens. But when he first encounters Corinth, it's actually described as fearful. And if you read 1 Corinthians 2, 1-5, it says very clearly, especially in the Greek, that there was a lot of trepidation as Paul is entering. Now think of this. Paul is entering a city. This is the Apostle Paul. This is the mighty Paul. Been in prison, it suffered all these things. And we're being told that as he enters into the city of Corinth, he is actually fearful because of the reputation, the debauchery of this particular city. And that's a very telling statement for, that's how bad the reputation of the city was. So we have to, and many of you who are very familiar with your Bibles, if you know anything about 1st and 2nd Corinthians, that church was fraught with all kinds of problems. But if you understand the context of the city and just what was surrounding it, is it any wonder that it struggled so much? Jimmy, you made a comment. Jimmy's made a comment, but we could all go to Greece. I would love it if we could get this pandemic done and over with, and we could all go to Greece, and we would just I would teach you some really nice Greek words, and not only that, I would teach you how to cook authentic Greek food, so you could thrive in your life. I'm sorry, but I was really looking forward to some of the Greek restaurants and that we were going to be a part of too. So anyway, I'm really missing that whole Greek thing, but that's just my heritage and my culture. But hopefully, I would love to take everybody there someday. But here in Corinth, this is where Paul meets Aquila and Priscilla, and they're categorized as tent makers, similar to the Apostle Paul. And some people argue for leather works, etc., etc. But it was common, by the way, in that day, for rabbis to have been taught a trade as part of the rabbinical training. Now, people don't realize this, that part of rabbinical training was just not in the learning of the law. They also were taught a trade as part of being able to take care of themselves. And plus, there was this feeling that if you worked with your hands, if you were part of it, like it did something for your spiritual life as well. There was something about, work that was valuable to the engagement of your spiritual health and vitality. So Paul would have done that. So in the synagogue, Paul is found preaching, but the Jews oppose him. Once again, they're causing Paul to reject them and turn to the Gentiles. And this happens. And Paul, in a vision from the Lord, is encouraged not to fear. Now again, I have a really big hang up in the fact that you hear people. I think it's a weaponized term in our culture today. Have faith over fear. But how many times do we see in the Bible that men of God who had the Spirit of God and this beautiful stories of incredible faith had moments of fear in their lives. It's what they did with that fear that is powerful. And here's God comforting the Apostle Paul, telling him not to fear and sort of encouraging him in a vision to do that. And there's a sense of weakness here in the Apostle Paul that we don't normally get as part of the historical story. And it's not to demean him, it's not to make him less of anything else, but it's to realize how human he was with a huge weight that he's carrying of a mission that God has given him. So he ministers in Corinth for a year and a half, a stay that in many ways has been documented as difficult by Paul personally. Now, we have two letters, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Historically, we know that Paul wrote 4 letters to Corinth. We know that. And it's a really long, convoluted kind of, if we were doing the 3-hour lectures in my class, I would give you the whole how we know there's actually 4 letters that Paul wrote. And there's some indication that what we have as 2 Corinthians may have possibly been letters 2 and 3, or 3 and 4, actually 3 and 4 if I remember right. So we have 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and where'd the other 2 go? We don't know. But we do know that Paul had a lot of difficulty and in this particular church. There's a trial of Gallio, the brother of Stoic philosopher Seneca, who was the tutor to Nero. So there's a huge connection. This particular person demonstrated that Rome and to see the whole trial with Gallio there is really important, because what it demonstrates is that Rome did not necessarily see Christianity as illegitimate. They saw this as a theological dispute, not a violation of Roman law. And that's going to be really important, Yeah. Oh, that's a great proverb, Robert. You brought up that Jewish, he who does not teach his son a trade teaches him to steal. That's a great proverb. Thanks for that. That kind of validates the statement earlier. Thank you. Appreciate it. Now, Paul, in marking a vow, shaves his head. And we have no idea what the vow entailed, but he made this vow, shaved his head, but most presumed it was an optional vow of thanksgiving to the Lord. And we have a brief interlude in Ephesus as we move out of Corinth, a city that became prominent in Paul's next missionary trip. And again, we get this kind of little open door about what's happening next. It's a little similar to what happened to the Macedonian call, to movement earlier in Antioch. We had that, but we've got this little open door that opens up about Ephesus, and it becomes a significant part of the later book of Acts that we're going to look at. Paul preaches at the synagogue there and is asked by the Jews to stay, but he declines, and he promises to return. which I think is kind of a little neat little interlude. So I have there in your notes Paul's second missionary journey. I have those maps and all the different places that they go. So hopefully you can follow through. I have the last slide here, and I might be just a couple more minutes to finish up our study. I'm really thankful for your patience. I know it's been a whirlwind of these 4 chapters, but as we get to the end, the church continues to grow. That's we've seen these little summary statements all the way through. Here we are in study number 7, and we're seeing them again. And there's a subtle shift in the text. It has been emerging for some time. Luke is demonstrating how the mantle of leadership and evangelism is growing well beyond the apostles. Luke is mentioning this. I've only focused on, a handful of people, Peter and Paul being the primary two. But there's so much missionary activity happening. There's so many people proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ, that they're not the only one. It's not like it's like the church wholesale is part of this movement. And, that's, what kind of a lesson is that for us today? When we just kind of segregate certain people, they must have the gift or whatever. But that doesn't seem to be the case in the early church. And Luke keeps repeating this. The focus of Acts it's not solely in conversions. It's in making disciples. That's why I kind of, when I teach the course, I kind of object to the whole evangelism thing, because that's really not the heart of Acts. The heart of Acts is making disciples, just like the Great Commission. Go into all the world, make disciples. That is what we are seeing in the book of Acts, because those two are so closely related. And it's shown in the interplay with Priscilla, Aquila, Apollos, all these individuals. They are, bringing people to Christ, but being a part of their lives and disciple them and bringing them into, the fullness of their faith in Christ. The scene is being set for the next phase of ministry, reminiscent of early chapters. The question of the believers receiving the Spirit once again comes to the fore. The Spirit of God is the primary force in the book of Acts. And recall how the Spirit prevented Paul from going to Asia in 16:6, but in his third missionary journey, Asia becomes the primary focus. So we get a shift of region on top of all of that. Okay, we're done. I'm only maybe 2 minutes after 8, or depending on your clock. But that was a whirlwind tour, 4 chapters in the book of Acts with a lot of stuff in there. Anyway, thanks for being a part of this. Thanks for joining us on this study of the book of Acts. We are done, and next week we go into 19, 20, 21, and hope you can read ahead. Again, like it if you get a chance. Subscribe if you get a chance. Tell others, and I hope you've been really blessed tonight. Thank you for your questions and the comments that many of you have made. And I'm hoping once the pandemic's done, I'm really thinking of putting another trip to Greece. I think that's on my bucket list. I don't want to depart this world until I can do a tour of Greece in a way that's going to honor everything about what we're learning in the journey of Paul. Okay? So thanks, everyone. Catch you next week. Thankful that the internet worked no problem today, but I hope you had a blast. Hope you've learned a lot, and we will catch you next week. Same time, and be blessed.